We continue our devotionals with the encounters with Jesus with a very famous story of Zacchaeus, the short tax collector. This story is found in Luke 19 when Jesus is passing through a city, and Zacchaeus is in that city and he desires to see him. Now, Zacchaeus is a tax collector, and in this time, these are the people who take from Israel and give to Rome, and they are despised and hated people. And Zacchaeus is the chief tax collector. And this causes him to be disliked quite a bit by the society around him. But in verse 3, he desires to see Jesus and see who this Jesus is. But he is too short in stature to see over the crowd. And this causes him a problem. He has a lack of sight. He has a lack of sight because of a physical attribute. But he also has a lack of sight in that he cannot see morally or spiritually how his actions are affecting those around him. And the story continues that he is a persistent man. So he climbs a tree and he looks to see Jesus. And in verse 5, Jesus comes into the story in a powerful way. In verse 5, it says that Jesus came and stopped at the spot where he was. And he looked up and said to him, "Zacchaeus, come down from there immediately, for I am going to stay with you." What Jesus is doing here is he is initiating the relationship with Zacchaeus. He is starting it. And he is looking up to Zacchaeus. This is an important phrase because nobody looked up to Zacchaeus. Zacchaeus is a short man in stature and despised by the culture. But Jesus does both here in that he looks up and he gives Zacchaeus dignity, and then he gives him honor by saying, "I'm staying with him." The crowd doesn't like this. The crowd judges both Jesus and Zacchaeus for this, saying, "How can Jesus stay with a sinner?" But in this, we start to see Zacchaeus' radical transformation of his encounter because he gives away 50% of his possessions and repays what he has stolen from Israel with interest. And so we see Zacchaeus having a radical transformation, and Jesus' response here is that salvation has come to this house, and the Son of Man has come to seek and save the lost. And Zacchaeus is both. On Monday, Pastor Dave talked about how Jesus has come to save and not condemn. Zacchaeus, instead of getting condemnation from Jesus, he gets redemption from him. And on Wednesday, Pastor Steve talked about how Jesus heals. And Zacchaeus is getting a moral and spiritual healing from Christ that begins a transformation in him. And the story of Zacchaeus ends here in Scripture, but history isn't done with him. A man named Clement of Alexandria writes about how Zacchaeus followed the Apostle Peter in his ministry. And the Apostle Peter gave him a bishop or a leadership of the church of Caesarea. Think about this. Zacchaeus, a man who was short, hated, and despised by the people around him, and even himself perhaps, has had a encounter with Jesus, which causes a radical transformation in his actions, in his behavior, and who he is. So much so that a short man becomes a spiritual giant and a leader to others. We are to be like Zacchaeus, seeking to see Jesus and to see how Jesus sees us in dignity and worth and the way that he always saw us, in a way to be transformed to be more like him. And we are to be like Jesus in seeing others in whatever circumstance they're in, whatever actions they're doing, whether it's immoral, right, wrong, whatever it is, to see them in dignity and worth. So as we continue to call people this week, see people like Jesus saw Zacchaeus with dignity and worth, and see yourself in the light of how Jesus sees us.